All right, thanks everyone. My name is Cody, and I am an alcoholic. Uh, and I I normally don't when I'm doing these types of things, I don't introduce myself as such, but I felt like it was appropriate today um based on the content. So I'm going to share my screen and then we'll get going here. And what I'd like to do, and I think the timing is pretty impeccable, since a lot of this information that I'm going to talk about today does come from chapter 11 of my book, The Shadow of a Figure of Light. But I'm not going to quote the book or anything today. I'm really going to try to go a different direction, um, and really try to unpack Carl Jung's, what he called his helpful formula in the 1961 letter to Bill Wilson. And the helpful formula was Spiritus Contra Spiritum. And before I get rolling too, I do want to thank you guys for coming. David, thank you for having me. I love, sharing here. I love this community. It's really an honor to be invited to participate in this way. And people that I know from other groups and stuff, like, thanks for coming, guys. It really does mean a lot. So we're going to use the archetype of the alcoholic to sort of unpack this occult phrase that Jung gave to Wilson. And that letter comes from the archives from 1961. You can find it in it's all over the internet and stuff. Um, and yeah, that letter is really what sort of spawned the archetype of the alcoholic, I guess. Because in the letter, Jung really he really sort of dissects the what I call the disease of alcoholism, the psycho-spiritual disease of alcoholism. He dissects it from an archetypal perspective, and I'm going to try to break down what I mean by that. I'm going to try to make this as approachable as possible. Um so uh the the one of to, what one of Jung's faults, if you can call it that, was that he seemed almost unwilling, I guess, to really simplify the concepts that he put forth. Um for people like us, right? The lay people. And this is a problem that we actually encounter even in the Bill Wilson letter that he wrote in 1961, where he introduces the helpful formula. So, and one thing about Carl Jung was that when he was writing, especially, and when he was talking, he very often was addressing a crowd of Jungian or would-be Jungian analysts, right? He was trying to train his people quite often. And so he's sort of speaking to them specifically, especially in some of the more kind of heady books that he wrote. But I mean, Bill Wilson was no Jungian analyst. But even in the Bill Wilson letter, there's really there's a lot of stuff that, it's easy to read on the surface and be like, oh, I understand what that says. But once you begin to understand more on a deeper level, so some of Jung's philosophies, then you see that his letter to Wilson was actually quite profound. And so that's what I'm going to try to do today is unpack it, right? So we start with the basic question: what is an archetype? And I decided to Google this. Google AI is pretty handy lately, and I figured it would give us a really approachable sort of something easy to digest. And this is what Google says that an archetype is. In Jungian psychology, an archetype is a universal innate pattern of thought or image that exists within the collective unconscious of all humans, representing fundamental human experiences and themes that appear across cultures and throughout history, often manifesting in myths, dreams, and stories. Essentially, it is a primordial model or blueprint for how we perceive and interact with the world around us, shaping our behaviors and motivations. So, Jung had said somewhere, and this is the way I like to understand this, he says that symbols are shaped energies. And essentially, Bill Wilson kind of hinted at this too. I think Wilson, he talks about the universal mind, and he spoke about the great reality, which I think is a great metaphor for what Jung called the objective psyche. And Wilson said, deep down in every man, woman, and child exists the fundamental idea of God. That is a very clear statement of an archetypal kind of a pattern, right? That deep down inside, all of us have this fundamental idea of God, um, but what Jung is saying is that symbols, because the God image is a symbol, right? And that underneath this symbol, there's an energy, like a little ball of energy, if you will. And essentially, what happens is, sorry about that, Paul. I just asked to unmute accidentally. What happens is that these energies will manifest themselves through symbols, through stories, through myths, and through dreams. And it's those energies, right, that form the impetus, right, that we call an archetype. And like all energetic forms, like in the whole universe, right, like in the physical universe, these energies that exist in the psyche are also bipolar, right, meaning there's like a positive and a negative side to them. And so these archetypal systems, if you will, they're energetic systems, and they're bipolar by nature. And that's really important to understand as we sort of dive into this. Now, we're not switching here. So in the letter to Wilson, Jung addresses an archetype which he calls the archetype of wholeness, right? And this is what he says to Wilson in the letter, and he's talking about Roland Hazard, and he's explaining. He says Roland's craving for alcohol was the equivalent on a low level of the spiritual thirst of our being for wholeness, expressed in medieval language, the union with God. So what Jung refers to here is a universal thirst for wholeness that all humans have, right? And the universal nature of that thirst is what makes it archetypal. And this thirst for wholeness that all humans have, it manifests in a certain class of people called alcoholics, right? It manifests for them as an insatiable craving for more alcohol, right? But what Jung is saying here is that this is actually a thirst for union with God, which is a really occult symbolical statement, even of it on its own. And this really is kind of, this is a big clue into Jungian thought here, right? Because he says that this is the way this idea was expressed in medieval language. And that's a phrase that we see again and again in this letter. We're not going to read the whole letter today, but if you go back and read it, you'll see that he refers to medieval language more than once. And for Jung, something that was medieval would have referred to, almost without exception, would have referred to something alchemical. So the alchemists were those medieval chemists, right? The early chemists that were trying to create gold out of lumps of matter and stuff like that. And so Jung really he was drawn to alchemical literature because it's so deeply symbolic, and he felt that it was a reflection of the process of individuation, or the process of spiritual awakening. So anyways, you're going to see a lot of retorts, alchemical retorts in some of the slides today. But if we want to understand Jung, we need to get into like this, a certain kind of symbolical mindset, right? Because symbols were a huge part of the way he interpreted the world, and a big part of the way that he interprets psychic change, right? And really, I mean, so Jung was highly involved in this concept of psychic change, just like we are over here in AA or the 12 steps. The psychic change is everything, right? That improved conscious contact. And so as we move on, so we're talking about our spiritual thirst, right? This thirst for wholeness, and this is an intangible thirst. I think Jung uses the word intangible in the letter. I can't remember, but I certainly understand it as intangible. And because it's kind of it's very similar to that alcoholic thirst, right? And I find that the thirst for wholeness and the craving for alcohol that the alcoholic experiences, those two things are really kind of mirror reflections of each other. They're sort of nebulous, right? And the thirst for wholeness is a paradoxical thirst, just like the thirst for alcohol is also a paradox. And the paradox is really simple, right? When it comes to alcohol, the more I drink, the thirstier I get. And so that makes it sort of this paradoxical experience, right? Um, the same thing sort of happens with this intangible thirst for wholeness, meaning we don't even really recognize that we have this intangible thirst until it's been fulfilled. And then we look back and we're like, wow, that's what I was thirsting for the whole time. This also explains why alcoholism and drug addiction have a spiritual solution, right? They're fundamentally it's a spiritual thirst. And if you're familiar with the letter that Jung wrote to Wilson, he introduces many symbols into the discussion to describe alcoholism, right? The main big symbols that Jung introduces in this letter are the symbols of God and the devil. And that's kind of a surprising twist, right? That a psychologist would talk about alcoholism in terms of this sort of cosmogonic warfare between God and his arch nemesis, the devil. But it's just symbols, right? We need to understand with Jung, it's always just symbols. So another symbol is this intangible thirst. That's also a symbolic statement, or it's a metaphor. Um, and the so and we so and then obviously there's another symbol here, and that's the deer, right? I have this deer here because what Jung said. So in order to sort of create his metaphor about this intangible spiritual thirst, he quotes the Psalm chapter 42, verse 1. It says, "As the hart panteth after the water brook, so panteth my soul after thee, O God." So the heart is actually a deer, and and this deer, and this would have been clear to Jung too. The deer is a universal symbol of spiritual renewal, because the deers shed their horns, right? Like a snake sheds its skin, so the deer sheds its horns. The deer is also considered to be the king of the forest, and so the deer has a crown, right? Those horns are the deer's crown, but the horns, he actually sheds the crown each year, right? So, and that's kind of a big symbol of what happens to us in this transformation process, right? If the deer is a symbol of the ego, and the ego, sort of gets this like kingly attitude that it's got to lose that attitude if it really wants to grow and survive. These become these kinds of symbols. So the deer would also sort of be likened to a lion, for example, the king of the jungle, right? And these are also symbolized by the sun, right? And the sun is a symbol of the ego as well. So this stuff would have all sort of been floating around in Jung's head when he gave Wilson this metaphor. And this imagery brings me to ponder the myth of Actaeon, the deer hunter. So Actaeon was out chasing deer one day with his hunting hounds in the forest. This is a Greek and a Roman myth. And when he's out in the forest, he accidentally stumbles upon one of the goddesses bathing, the goddess named Artemis, who's pictured here. And she was the goddess of chastity and of the hunt. And also another name for Artemis is Luna, right? Or Diana. So she's also a symbol of the moon. But so she's outraged that Actaeon, the hunter, sees her naked. And so she turns him into a deer, whereupon his own hunting hounds turn on him and basically chew him to pieces, right? So psychologically speaking, this myth sort of tells us it's a story about what happens to an ego that gets initiated too early, when it stumbles on a vision of the anima, the soul, before it's ready, right? It's the danger of an immature ego having too big of a spiritual experience, and so that's how Jung most likely would have interpreted this myth and this concept of the deer. But I wonder too if he didn't have another interpretation in mind, since his letters dripping in so much kind of spirituality, right? And so because so and this is the thing, since I've written this book, so I introduced the concept of the archetype of the alcoholic, right? And the question is like, does this concept actually hold water? Can this concept can it stand up to the scrutiny that certainly the Jungian crew is gonna foist upon it, and perhaps others, right? And viewing the world through this sort of archetypal lens, right, through the archetype of the alcoholic, what's really struck me is this, and because I'm looking for it now, I see it everywhere, is that the the message that's given in most circles today, including psychology and Jungian psychology, all freaking everywhere, is that, and it's like this: if you want a quick and easy spiritual experience, then you need to go to Mexico and eat ayahuasca, or go to Oregon and eat some mushrooms, or go to your psychologist and drop some LSD or whatever it is, right? The culture holds intoxication as sort of a highly spiritual endeavor, right? And this tells me a lot about the archetype of the alcoholic, right? It's that all of us sort of unconsciously connect intoxication with spirituality or mysticism. So now, if we go back to the myth of Actaeon and Artemis, the way I read this myth in terms of the archetype of the alcoholic is to say that in the early days, right, of our drinking and using, we get a glimpse of we get spiritual connection through intoxication, right? But we're still uninitiated, right? For most of us, this happens when we're really young, and it's almost as if we stumble upon one of the goddesses bathing, and we don't have her consent to see what we see, and essentially we have to pay for that sin by learning too much too soon, right? And so then and what happens is the very thing that we're using to sort of break down these barriers and have these experiences then turns upon us and chews us to shreds. Bill Wilson's allegory of the boomerang is very fitting here, right? We throw the boomerang out and it comes back around and just cuts us to shreds. And what we say is we earn our seats here, right? But when we get here, this is the thing about that I find really fascinating about 12 steps and Alcoholics Anonymous, is that we come in the door with sort of this really kind of pre-programmed understanding of spirituality, and we sort of dive into this kind of deeper understanding of spirit, right? It's different than what we see like in religion and stuff, right? Like it's more of a whole experience, right? Because we're dealing with so much darkness here, and that in Jung's perspective was what the religions are lacking, right? Is that access to the darkness. So anyways, Actaeon, if we go back to the myth again, it is a myth of regeneration. And what happens is that the hounds tear up Actaeon, they tear him into little pieces, and that's what takes place with us, right? When we come in and we start to work the steps, is we sort of chop ourselves up into tiny little sort of bite-sized pieces, and then we basically eat them, right? And if you think about the Jesus myth when he breaks the bread, or and there's all kinds of myths where the gods get eaten, that we sort of eat and digest the gods, right? That's a symbol of us assimilating those parts of ourselves in a digestible way and reassimilating them, right? And basically what happens is then we're regenerated. So that's what's kind of taking place in this Actaeon myth. Now, I have as far as I know, I've been the first to make the case that the 12 steps that were introduced by Bill Wilson in 1938, 1939, they also represent they are representative of a modern myth, right? And just like the ancient myths, the 12 steps tell the tale of the struggle between the humans and the gods. So there's this divine drama, right, that takes place in every myth, and that drama, it's the same drama that takes place in the alcoholic and drug addict's world. And like every myth, it's starting to rain. I hope you guys can't hear that too much. Like every myth, right? It's full of symbols, okay? And what we have in this myth is on the one hand, we have the symbols of the gods, the higher powers, and on the other hand, we have the symbols of the humans, right? And that's the same as in all myths as well. And so what we have then is this character called the anonymous alcoholic, right? This is the we of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's the first sentence that you encounter in the book. In the forward to the first edition, it's also the first phrase, and there is a solution, which was meant to be chapter 1 of the book. So we of Alcoholics Anonymous, right? It's also that we that's in front of each of the 12 steps. We came to believe, we admitted we were powerless, okay? So this we of Alcoholics Anonymous is this sort of mythological character. If we want to look at the steps through this symbolic lens, this is how we get there. And basically this character, the beautiful thing about this character, right, is that Bill Wilson purposefully crafted this character as a psychological mirror for his readers. And we all know that in the 12 steps, but we never see that as a myth, right? Because that's the same thing myth is meant to do. We're supposed to see ourselves in the myth, right? That's what brings the most meaning out of the myth, is if we're able to see ourselves within it. Now, what emerges then from this anonymous alcoholic, this sort of image of this anonymous alcoholic, right? As nebulous as that concept is, but what emerges out of that is the concept of the archetype of the alcoholic. And recall that symbols are shaped energies, right? So the energy is the archetype, but the symbol then is what makes the archetype visible. It's what allows us to see this really unconscious concept, this energy. It allows us to see it and put form to it, and then we can begin to understand it more, because the ego needs these things in order to understand the unconscious. That's why the unconscious always presents itself in terms of symbols. So we have dreams, we have myths, we have active imagination. These are the symbols, and the unconscious is expressing itself. So this is really interesting to me, is that so I'm surprised that in the Jungian crowd that the archetype of the alcoholic had never been talked about before. But I figured out why the other day. Ming and I were talking, and she said, it's easy, right? Now, keep in mind, these archetypes are these energies, and they're bipolar, meaning that there's a higher and a lower sort of manifestation of these energies, right? The reason nobody ever thought to dig into the archetype of the alcoholic was because they never imagined that it had a higher purpose, right? Like we can talk about the spirituality of intoxication, right? But that's different than alcoholism, right? And whether it's different or not, I'm going to let you decide after this talk. But the point is that we wouldn't want to talk about the archetype of the alcoholic, because nothing good ever came out of alcoholism, right? And so that's why this was sort of this low-hanging fruit. And it's why the archetype of the alcoholic was never talked about until now. But I'm going to tell you, this understanding this archetype is going to be the key that unlocks Jung's letter to Wilson. And so moving on then. So I want to just recap. So we're able to postulate the existence of the archetype of the alcoholic because all of us have an unconscious thirst for union with God, a thirst for wholeness, right? That's experienced by every human being. Also, recovery from alcoholism is a prototypical spiritual process. And we know this, right? We talk about this all the time in the meetings, but that the same actions we take in the steps are found in other traditions as well. And while we don't promote the 12 steps outside of our fellowships, we do share many processes in common with other traditions, including Jungianism, right? And I make that case pretty clear in my book. And so when I wrote the book, I had postulated the existence of the archetype of the alcoholic, and I just kind of briefly mentioned it. But then about a year later, and this was before the book was published, but I read Jung's essay called "On the Psychology of the Trickster Figure." He wrote it in 1954. And basically, when I was reading this essay, I was blown away because he was describing alcoholism, right? He never uses the word alcohol in the essay, but to me, it just was like dripping in alcoholism. And then I realized that the trickster is the alcoholic, right? And then this is one of the statements that Jung gives us in that essay. He says, "The phantom of the trickster haunts the mythology of all ages, sometimes in quite unmistakable form, sometimes in strangely modulated guise." So, in other words, the trickster has reemerged today in modern culture as the alcoholic. And this is the case that I'm making. And it's the key to the letter. So in the essay, I'm going to go through a few things that I'll list some bullet points here, and I couldn't help but see these corollaries, right? And And the fact that the alcoholic and the trickster share so many things in common is actually quite striking. And this really helps us to unlock Jungian thought in a very profound way. So I'm going to read through some of these and comment on them briefly, and I'm sure that many of you will relate. So first of all, Jung says that the trickster is a summation of all the inferior traits of individuals. And so this is clear, right? The trickster represents the shadow. And I can't think of any more unique or profound representation of the shadow than the typical alcoholic trope that we have today, especially those of us within the fellowships, and we understand alcoholism and what it was like to be a practicing alcoholic, right? And all the shadow stuff that's involved in that. The second one is that the trickster is a negative hero and yet manages to achieve through his stupidity what others fail to accomplish with their best efforts. Now, as these slides go on, we're going to see that the trickster undergoes a metamorphosis, right? And changes and has a psychic change. But in terms of the way this happens for the trickster, Jung tells us it happens through his own stupidity, right? And that other people fail to accomplish this even with their best efforts. And so keep that in mind as well. The next one is, the trickster is wild, wanton, and irresponsible. Need I say more? The next one, the trickster is a faithful reflection of an absolutely undifferentiated human consciousness, a psyche that has hardly left the animal level. I mean, I don't know about you, but for me, for decades, I was living on the animal level, right? And I would just do these heinous things and then wonder why I was doing them, and just knowing how wrong it was, right? But feeling basically powerless to do anything different. That's living on an animal level. The next one is the trickster's at the mercy of annoying accidents which thwart his will and his actions. Now, we learn this in the 12 steps, right? And we're actually quite lucky to learn this, because I think the general population has a hard time with this one, right? Is that those annoying accidents were actually our own fault, that our troubles were of our own making. And that's the beauty of the trickster, right? This trickster complex in the psyche is actually meant to trick us into waking up to the fact that we are not always in control. And we just have such clear access to that in the 12 steps. And this is really the key to our success in the 12-step fellowships, right? Is that we're conscious of this thing we call the alcoholic mind. And then the trickster represents the defects of the personality. I mean, I can't find a more clear representation of alcoholism than to say that it is a representation of the defects of the personality. And that's Jung's phrase. That's not Bill Wilson's phrase, although he probably said it somewhere. It's so clear and correlated to what we talk about. And then finally, the trickster is deserted by his or her human companions below their level of consciousness, right? And so I love the way we say it, right? That we sought lower companions because our our human companions, right? They were no longer interested in our company. So where did we go? We went, to the dive bars and across the tracks and wherever else we went to seek those lower companions. These are all trickster traits. And since I've postulated the existence of the archetype of the alcoholic, I've never read a description of the trickster that didn't fit with the alcoholic perfectly. The two can be substituted one for another. Now, the mind-blowing thing is that Jung isn't describing the alcoholic here, right? He's describing the trickster, and that this trickster shows up in every myth. I think it's safe to say that in our times, the trickster has been reconstellated as the alcoholic, the archetype of the alcoholic. And in this citation, Jung tells us that the trickster isn't even evil. And this sentence just blew me away, because it sounds like you're sitting in an AA meeting. It says, Jung says, the trickster is in many respects stupider than even the animals and gets into one ridiculous scrape after another, although he is not really evil, and he does the most atrocious things from sheer unconsciousness and unrelatedness. In other words, he's unrelated to the other humans in his life. His imprisonment in animal unconsciousness is suggested by the episode where he gets his head caught inside the skull of an elk And the next episode shows how he overcomes this condition by imprisoning the head of a hawk inside his own rectum. And that's where this little image comes from. True, he sinks back into the former condition immediately afterwards by falling under the ice and is outwitted time after time by the animals, but in the end he succeeds in tricking the cunning coyote, and this brings back to him his savior nature. The trickster is a primitive cosmic being of divine animal nature, on the one hand superior to man because of his superhuman qualities, and on the other hand inferior to him because of his unreason and unconsciousness, right? And so in spite of all this stupidity, right, that surrounds this trickster character, or the alcoholic, right, these two things are equal. They're literally equal within the realm of the psyche. What begins to emerge, right, is a metamorphosis, right? And this is what's central to these archetypes, right? And these myths, right? It's not just that this person was unconscious at one point, but it's that in spite of all that unconsciousness, there's a change that takes place, right? And we have the metamorphosis. So we said earlier that the trickster achieves through stupidity what others fail to do with their best efforts. That's because, as Jung says, there is something of the trickster in the character of the shaman and the medicine man. The shaman is the wounded wounder who becomes, or the trickster is the wounded wounder who becomes the agent of healing, the sufferer who takes away suffering and who turns the meaningless into the meaningful. And so, and this obviously, right, this, it seems pretty clear to me that this same energy constellated in Bill Wilson's mind when he devised the heroic adventure through the 12 steps. On one hand, we have this powerlessness, this unmanageability, right? This incomprehensible demoralization, right? It's not an evil person, it's a sick person. And underlying this sort of sickness is just this longing for spiritual connection that at one point the person felt through intoxication, right? But then we come over to step 12, right? After the journey's been made, and we have Wilson's suggestion that basically after we've had a transformation, we're to carry the message to other people who are suffering a similar fate. And so what we see then is the dualistic nature of these archetypes, right? And this underlying this is this concept of wholeness, which means, and wholeness, so the archetype of wholeness means that we fuse the opposites of our nature. In other words, that we assimilate the darkness and the light, right? That these two things come together in one kind of single experience. So there's a perfect example of this is if I announce myself, hello, my name is Cody and I'm a grateful alcoholic, right? That's really a symbol or a sign, if you will, of a person who has essentially attained wholeness through the means of the archetype of the alcoholic. So basically then we have this sort of foundation, right? So, and now we're going to actually dive a little deeper. I hope you guys are still following me. Thanks for sticking around. So there's many aspects of Jung's letter that have allowed us to postulate the existence of the archetype of the alcoholic. And there's basically three that I see. The first one is that this thirst for wholeness that we've been talking about is a universal psychological phenomenon. Everybody experiences the thirst for wholeness. It manifests in alcoholics as alcoholism, but that alone makes the existence of the archetype of the alcoholic possible. The second is Jung's description of alcoholism in the letter. And what he does in the letter, if you go back and read it after in one of these coming days, is just, and you'll see, is that Jung is talking about these huge symbols to describe alcoholism, these huge archetypal symbols. God is an archetype, and so is the devil. And the devil is actually another name for the trickster. Man, I'm gonna have to get a drink of water. Hold on. Glass of water with me. So the devil is another name for the trickster, actually. And so that's another way that we can sort of see the archetypal nature of alcoholism. Then, but the third level or the third sort of point that I want to make here is, and this is kind of the most intriguing point to me. This is why I want to spend so much time on it, is Jung's helpful formula. Spiritus Contra Spiritum. Like the other two universal aspects, this one is also a phrase that he pulls from the vaults of medieval thought, right? And that's pretty clear once I read it. The and interestingly too, in terms of this great tradition that we've inherited, right? Is that the other two components, the universal thirst, the Psalm 42 chapter 1, and then this cosmogonic battle being waged between God and the devil, those two ideas stem from medieval Christian theology, whereas this last one is more of an alchemical recipe. And that grows out of a Gnostic tradition, right, which was sort of the underground current of the medieval times that eventually grew into alchemy. And so and I think it's just an interesting side note to have in mind that Jung would have probably had this in mind when he formulated this letter. And here is Jung's helpful formula, or Jung's, and it really is an alchemical recipe, right? This is what Jung says to Wilson in 1961. You see, alcohol in Latin is spiritus, and you use the same word for the highest religious experience as well as the most depraved poison. The helpful formula, therefore, is spiritus contra spiritum. Now, when we talk about, I hope that your mind's kind of drifted back to the concept of the trickster, this animalistic character, as the most depraved aspect, right? And then we have the shift or the metamorphosis into the shaman, right? So that sort of those two poles are really represented here in this letter. When we talk about this spiritus contra spiritum, so what Jung is really introducing here is a deeper layer of the idea of wholeness, right? Which he called the coniunctio oppositorum. And that is, so in Jungian thought, the coniunctio is equal to wholeness. Those two things are essentially interchangeable. So this means that in order to achieve wholeness, one must achieve a coniunctio, or in really kind of layman terms, it means that we need to fuse the opposites that are represented by the trickster and the shaman, or the opposites of our own nature. And these are the two, we need to fuse the two poles of the archetype of the alcoholic. So I Googled this one too. I said, hey, Google, what is the coniunctio oppositorum? And this is what Google told me. Coniunctio oppositorum is an alchemical term that means union of opposites. The phrase describes the combination of opposites, such as good and evil, matter and spirit, or high and low. The goal is to create a synthesis that unites the polarized conflict of opposites into a third point. And so, so that's the framework then through which we're going to look at Jung's helpful formula. And what's happening here, right, is okay, so I want to touch on this, right? Because we can look at Jung's helpful formula from a reductionist point of view, which is kind of a surface level interpretation. It doesn't require any imagination. It's certainly not interested in a symbolical interpretation, right? So from a reductionist point of view, we would say simply this, that spiritus contra spiritum means that we combat alcoholism with spirituality, right? That we counter alcoholism with spirituality. And there, you couldn't argue that that's not the case, right? That is our experience. But from a reductionist point of view, then you wouldn't go any deeper than that, right? But if we're trying to get to a level below simply reductive, which is archetypal, then we're going to look at this from an entirely different angle. And that would mean that we're not trying to counter alcoholism with spirituality, but that we're trying to create a conjunction of the opposites, right? A coniunctio oppositorum. That's the archetypal perspective. So if we look at it from this in this way, and I have the phrase here so you can see it. The helpful formula is spiritus contra spiritum. The way we would sort of interpret that in the archetypal perspective would be to say that the word contra does not mean to counter, right? But it actually means counter to. In other words, what Jung is saying here in Latin is that spiritus is the opposite of spiritum and vice versa, even though etymologically speaking, the two words are the same, right? So what and so this, what emerges then is a duplex symbol. And alchemy, Jungian psychology, and 12-step ideology, they're all full of these duplex symbols. The alcoholic itself is a duplex symbol, and I'm going to explain more about this as we keep going. So, and here are some of those symbols. So the alcoholic, right? Because the alcoholic, so I'm Cody and I'm an alcoholic, and I'm an alcoholic whether I'm drunk or sober, right? And that in one hand, like the lowest, most depraved aspects of my life come as you know, grow out of my alcoholism. But on the other hand, it's also the greatest blessing of my life that I'm an alcoholic, right? Because it actually gave me access to this spiritual world. So that's a duplex symbol. There's some other ones. The Trickster Shaman, that's a duplex symbol, right? We just talked about Spiritus Spiritum, right? That's a duplex symbol because spiritus is this, it's the same word in both usages, right? So that's also a duplex symbol. The other one is character defects, greatest assets. That's a duplex symbol because, and that's straight out of the big book. Our defects of character would become our greatest assets or whatever. We understand this, right? Because they become useful tools as we try to help others. Another one is the gift of desperation and the higher power, right? We understand this in the 12 steps as also a duplex symbol, right? That's what's taking place here. It's this, and keep in mind, these are all paradoxical, right? That's the whole point of, you know, everything that sort of stems out of the unconscious is going to come across as paradoxical. It means that the ego won't be able to really wrap its head around it. These are all paradoxes. The highest religious experience in contrast to the most depraving poison, another duplex symbol. And then finally, there's one called Mercurius. And this is an interesting one that I just need to touch on because it's really fundamental to interpreting Jung's helpful formula. So like the alcoholic, Mercurius is an antithetical image that's representative on one hand of the most depraving poison, which in alchemy would have been called the prima materia, right? That's this sort of the lower aspect of Mercurius. But then in the higher aspect of Mercurius, he is a representative of the philosophical stone or the lapis, right? So and the Mercurius is also he's the exact same symbol as the trickster, right? And if we're going to understand this alchemical interpretation of Jung's letter, then we have to understand Mercurius. And I'll come back to Mercurius in a little while. So a great way to visualize the fusion of opposites, or wholeness, right, is to basically force some rationale onto it. And the way we do that is with images like this. And this was something that Jung introduced. This is called a quaternity symbol. And this is what Jung says this about this sort of framework for looking at these symbols. The quaternity always represents a consciously reflected and differentiated totality that appears in dreams as an expression of wholeness. So if you have these kinds of images in your dreams, pay attention because they're really giving you good news about where you're at on this spiritual journey. But to really break down this quaternity symbol, it's actually quite simple. So on one hand, we have the trickster, that animalistic aspect, and then the trickster undergoes a transformation and becomes the shaman. And then on the same hand, we have the active alcoholic, right? The animalistic aspect of the trickster. Those two are equal. But then that person, that individual, that psychic complex undergoes a transformation and becomes a sober alcoholic. So within the context of our quest for wholeness, right? This image tells us at first glance that wholeness emerges out of the conjunction of these things. So this image in particular shows how in my own psyche, when I was writing the book, how this quaternity emerged, right? Because as I was imagining the archetype of the alcoholic, I was able to compare it to the trickster and the shaman. And so that's, you know, essentially what Jung's saying here is that is an expression of wholeness. So, and there's a lot of these around, like, and I'm going to go through some more examples of them, but essentially what happens is this is sort of a visualization of what happens during an entire psychic change. Here's another quaternity image that is based on Jung's letter, right? And it's really central to Jung's helpful formula, which is this: spiritus and spiritum, in comparison with, or in contrast to, or whatever, to the most depraving poison and the highest religious experience. That is a quaternity symbol that he's expressing in the letter to Bill. And so, and this is the beauty of this, right? As members of a 12-step fellowship, we can very simply put our own experience into this formula and see how a certain level of wholeness has emerged for us because of it. Each of these images is a reflection of the dynamics at work in the archetype of the alcoholic, right? This image, I love this because it represents the action of alcohol upon the alcoholic, but which is at the same time the highest religious experience mixed with the most depraving poison. That was my experience, right? Is like this thing that was about to kill me or would have killed me was also giving me this huge kind of spiritual release. And so these kinds of paradoxical symbols function on both ends of the psychic spectrum, the lowest and the highest. That Jung always refers to the lowest and the highest, and his letter to Bill is no different. So yeah, we'll come back to some of these symbols later on. And yeah, we're getting a little closer. We don't have too much further to go, so bear with me. So Jung gives us the central meaning of the Spiritus Contra Spiritum paradox in this phrase right here. And this is not from the Bill letter, but it's something that I dug up that really explains what's taking place. He says, inasmuch as you attain to the numinous experiences, you are released from the curse of pathology. Even the very disease takes on a numinous character. So, I mean, this phrase might as well describe recovery from alcoholism. Because it really gets to the point of what we do in AA, right? To have an experience of the numinosum, or to attain to the numinous experiences, that's essentially what we're talking about in the 12 steps. So when Bill had his white light experience, that could be considered a numinous experience. When we get to step 11 and we begin to, or probably we've already improved our conscious contact with God to a great degree, what we're experiencing, right, that spiritual experience, that is to experience the numinous. And as we do that, the further along we get in this sort of numinous experience, then the more we see the disease having taken on a numinous character. In other words, the disease is playing a central role to our spiritual transformation, even after we're not struck by the disease anymore. Right. But it's kind of still there. In terms of alchemy, it's the prima materia, that thing that is getting converted into the philosophical gold. So back to Mercurius. So recall that Jung said that what emerges is a third thing, right? So for alchemists, the symbol that conveyed this concept was called Mercurius. And this is taken from the old Greek and Roman myths of Hermes, right? The messenger of the god. Hermes was also a trickster. He stole Apollo's cattle and stuff like that. But he really made his way into medieval consciousness as Mercurius, this main character in the alchemical kind of process, right? And just like we saw with the trickster, the alchemist descriptions of Mercurius are spot on in terms of the archetype of the alcoholic. They're literally one and the same. And so Mercurius is also a duplex symbol and is synonymous with the alcoholic and with the trickster. This is what Jung says. And when I read this, you can think of Mercurius, the alcoholic, or the trickster. They're all the same. A curious combination of trickster motifs can be found in the alchemical figure of Mercurius. For instance, his fondness for sly jokes and malicious pranks, his powers as a shapeshifter, his dual nature, half animal, half divine, his exposure to all kinds of tortures, and last but not least, his approximation to the figure of a savior. These qualities make Mercurius seem like a daemonic being resurrected from primitive times. And so, yeah, Mercurius, just like the alcoholic, is a paradoxical image of wholeness, and that he's central to Jung's helpful formula. I love this. In alchemy, the fusion of the opposites manifests in the birth of a new creature, right? This was called Mercurius the Sun, the Filius Mercurius. So, and I love this because this Mercurius character was described as desperately elusive and unknown. And so equating the alcoholic archetype with Mercurius also, just in my own life, has really allowed me to understand Jungian concepts in a really profound way, really nuanced, right? And so and the alchemist would have said, like, it's all of us need to sort of find access to this idea of Mercurius, right? And which we do by cultivating a symbolic life, and which we already have our fingers on as in terms of the disease of alcoholism, because it's such a duplex complex, right? That we're already right there. Like, we already understand this whole thing. And this is what so the Mercurius is desperately elusive. And this is from an alchemical recipe. It says, but where is this golden mercury, this radical moisture, which dissolved in sulfur and salt becomes the animated seed of metals? So in other words, this thing that transforms. Ah, he is incarcerated and held so fast that even nature cannot release him from the harsh prison unless the master art opened the way. And I just think that that's a beautiful sort of symbolic description of recovery from alcoholism. And there's another one I want to read too. The volatile essence, so carefully shut up and preserved in the hermetic vessel, could not be left to itself for a moment, because this elusive Mercurius would then escape and return to its former nature, as, according to the testimony of the alchemist, not infrequently happened. In other words, the alchemist had to be really careful with the vapor and stuff that was in the retort. They had to keep the lid on it and keep it hermetically sealed, because they were afraid that that substance would just leave and float away, right? And that substance, that transformed substance, was Mercurius. And so if you think about that in terms of alcoholism, right? And like, we have newcomers come in, and it's just this really nebulous kind of thing that they're dealing with. And they're asking for questions, for answers, and we kind of have answers. We're like, oh, go to a meeting, or say your prayers, or whatever it is, right? That there's this volatile essence that's so, it needs to be taken such good care of, because it's so elusive and it can just escape. And then once it's gone, it's like, oh no, we have to start all over again. And they go back out and have to go through that whole rigmarole one more time, right? And then they come back in and they try it again. This alchemical sort of formulation is such a beautiful metaphor of recovery from alcoholism. Wilson also said that we were reborn, right? So if Mercurius is the sun that's created out of this this alchemical recipe, then in 12-step ideology, we say we were reborn, and a new creature emerges, right? And that creature has conjoined the opposites, right? This is the sober alcoholic. That's a paradox in itself. In this drawing, Mercurius is depicted as holding the staff of Hermes in either hand. And you can see the opposites of the sun and the moon. Here, there's these snakes. Mercurius is wearing a crown. So this is all kind of a symbol of this psychic change, right? And this, and I want to say this because, psychologically speaking, the alcoholic plays essentially the same role in our transformation as Mercurius did for the alchemist, or does for Jung's conception of psychic change. And so this is a big deal in Jungian psychology, is to have a sort of an image of this. And I'm going to read this quote now. And while I read this, I want you to think of Mercurius equals the alcoholic, or equals my disease, right? My experience. And just how closely this fits. He says, you must always, this is Edward Edinger, the great Jungian analyst. He says, you must always remember that Mercurius is the personification of the autonomous unconscious. The original Mercurius, meaning the one who hasn't been transformed, the trickster, is the unconscious in its original unconscious state. That's a perfect description of alcoholism. Mercurius, as the lapis, or the transformed, is the unconscious when the ego has related to it consciously, right? In other words, when we take step one, the conscious ego relates to the unconscious, right? It admits that it's powerless, that there's something in the psyche that the ego doesn't have control over. Out of the original Mercurius, or the active alcoholism, Sol and Luna emerge as a pair of opposites. When these opposites are again united, they give birth to the sun, the Filius, which is the equivalent to the Lapis. So in other words, these opposites constellate, right, in terms of the archetype of the alcoholic, and what is born is this new creature that hopefully we can all relate to. So, and then this is another quaternity, right? That's meant to sort of give us sort of a visual of what's being said in this helpful formula, Spiritus Contra Spiritum. And this would have been definitely on Jung's mind when he wrote this, that on one hand, we have the original Mercurius, right? The prima materia, the thing that needs to be transformed and changed, and that it goes through a transformation and becomes this new creature, Filius Mercurius, right? The shaman, right? The sober alcoholic. And sort of underlying that is the Spiritus Contra Spiritum paradox that really underlies all sort of spiritual transformation. So let me check the time. I can't see the time. All right. So, and we're wrapping up here. There's a couple more slides I want to get through. And I read this slide in an earlier talk, and I kind of want to read it here again because I think it makes more sense now. It says, in spite of, or perhaps because of its affinity with instinct, the archetype represents the authentic element of spirit, but a spirit which is not to be identified with human intellect, since it is the latter's spiritus rector. So he's essentially telling us that these archetypes are really representative of spirituality and of spirit, right? And they're the guiding, they're the guide. It's not the same as this ego's concept of spirit, but these archetypes come from a deeper place and are the guiding lights. The essential content of all mythologies and all religions and all isms, so this includes the 12 steps as well as alcoholism, is archetypal. The archetype is spirit or anti-spirit. What it ultimately proves to be depends on the attitude of the human mind. Archetype and instinct are the most polar opposites imaginable, as can easily be seen when one compares a man who is ruled by his instinctual drives, like the trickster, with a man who is seized by the spirit, like the sober alcoholic. But just as between all opposites there obtains so close a bond that no position can be established or even thought of without its corresponding negation, so in this case also les extremes se touchent, the opposites touch. They belong together as correspondences, which is not to say that the one is derivable from the other, but that they subsist side by side as reflections in our own minds of the opposition that underlies all psychic energy. In other words, this is important. He's saying that these opposites, right, they're one is not derivable from the other, but they exist in the realm of the psyche or the spirit. They exist side by side. Man finds himself simultaneously driven to act and free to reflect. This contrariety in his nature has no moral significance, for instinct is not in itself bad any more than spirit is good. Both can be both. Negative electricity is as good as positive electricity. First and foremost, it is electricity. The psychological opposites, too, must be regarded from a scientific standpoint. True opposites are never incommensurables. If they were, they could never unite. All contrariety notwithstanding, they do show a constant propensity to union, and Nicholas of Susa, a medieval mystic, defined God himself as a complexio oppositorum. In other words, that's just kind of a recap of the dualistic nature of these energies, these psychic energies. There's a positive and a negative. And just like we can't get electricity without both kind of flowing together in a common channel, right? There's no spark. Same thing with spirit, right? If we don't have both the highest and the lowest, then there's not going to be any spiritual momentum. And so we have another quaternity here, the God image versus instinct, right? Those two are opposites. And then we have the spiritum and spiritus. So, and essentially the thirst for wholeness is, so this kind of represents this concept of wholeness. So if we were driven by an instinctual thirst for alcohol, that's replaced by a thirst for the God image, right? And a connection with the God image. And then of course, the Spiritus Contra Spiritum paradox kind of underlies the whole thing. I want to touch on the most depraving poison. So he says, you see alcohol in Latin is spiritus, and you use the same word for the highest religious experience as well as the most depraved poison. So Jung said in the quote I read that man is simultaneously driven to act and yet free to reflect. The trickster is that part of the psyche that drives the ego towards collapse. Wilson, in his letter to Jung, had said that alcoholism represented an impossible dilemma, and that it eventuated that his ego collapsing at depth, right? That's a very psychological perspective of what happens in active alcoholism, right? And it's the trickster that drives that whole situation, that creates this whole debacle that leads to the collapse of the ego. In the helpful formula, Jung mentions the most depraving poison in contrast to the highest religious experience. And what I want to say is this, is that in alchemy, sulfur was the most depraving poison. That was sulfur. Sulfur tarnishes other metals that it comes in contact with. But sulfur is also a duplex symbol, right? Because on one hand, it has a double meaning. So sulfur on one hand, it's combustible, right? Sulfur is you can light that shit on fire, right? So on one hand, it symbolizes this that element that will literally burn our lives to the ground that we're all so familiar with here. But then on the other hand, sulfur represents a life-giving warmth. It's sort of that inspiration, right? That's how sulfur plays into this. And so in this quote, Jung tells us that sulfur, he compares sulfur to this unconscious compulsion, right? And compulsion is such a key element in 12-step ideology, and Jung's really referring to it here in the letter. But this is not from the letter, but this is what Jung says about sulfur. The unconscious dynamism would correspond to sulfur, for compulsion is the great mystery of human life. I mean, isn't that an amazing statement? Compulsion is the great mystery of human life. That means step one is the great mystery of human life, right? Compulsion is the thwarting of our conscious will and of our reason by an inflammable element within us, appearing now as a consuming fire and now as a life-giving warmth. This lack of freedom lies in the unconscious and forms that part of the personality which still has to be added to the conscious man in order to make him whole. Compulsion, therefore, has two sources, the shadow and the self. And so basically then, what we have is compulsion it really formulates another quaternity. There's a couple more, right? So on one hand, if we look at compulsion, right, when we're driven by 100 forms of fear, when we're driven by a craving for alcohol, whatever that is, that's that sulfur element. But then on the other hand, when we achieve sobriety and we find a spiritual vocation in the 12 steps and we're helping people and we're doing the 12 step, right, then that's also sort of compulsion, right? It's not discipline. We're being driven to behave this way. And then on the other hand, compulsion is a consuming fire and a life-giving warmth. And then another sort of quaternity that struck me this morning, and I added this in here, was we have the gift of desperation and the group of drunks, right? I love that quaternity, because in my own kind of spiritual endeavor, like that like God first manifests as the gift of desperation. And then, to be honest, for 4 or 5 years in early sobriety, God was the group of drunks. That's all I had. And I kind of purposely made that decision because I didn't want to think my way out of AA. And then of course, Spiritus Contra Spiritum, at the center of it all. And so all of this is to say why it's important that we understand this archetypal approach. And I got 2 more slides left, and I really love what Ettinger says here, because he's describing these how we get down to these different layers in our spiritual understanding as well as in recovery. And I found this to just really be so fitting, right? As a description of recovery from alcoholism. He says, we first experience sulfur through the shadow because sulfur is the inflammable element. But after a lengthy period of analyzing our complexes, hopefully we get to their core, which is an archetype. The archetypal energy, the fire, the sulfur that's at the root of the complexes, derives from the self. Then we begin to experience compulsion, what sets us on fire, not as the product of our complexes, but as an expression of the self. That's what he's saying too when he says that the numinous, the pathology itself becomes numinous. Here, the important idea is that the compulsive dynamic of all complexes, including alcoholism, derives from the self. When you see that, then you don't have a complex anymore, which doesn't mean, however, that you aren't subject to inflammable effects. Not at all. But it does mean that you are experiencing them on a deeper level, and they become part of an ongoing dialogue with the self. Before one sees that such things derive from the self, one is in constant danger of being possessed by a complex. In other words, of catching on fire from the inflammability of the sulfur in the complex. And so, um, you know, I just, you know, it's kind of heartbreaking that the people who come up with these really profound and interesting descriptions of recovery, or you know, spiritual change in general, psychological changes, that they don't spend more time in the rooms of 12-step meetings, right? Because what they're describing is exactly what takes place for us, right? uh and I love what he says here about how once we realize, so when we took step one and we came to believe in step two that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity, what we did there was we took the complex, if you want to call alcoholism a complex, we got to a deeper level, right? This archetypal level. And we realized that there was something inside of our own mind, this mystery of compulsion, that was more powerful than we were, and that was making choices that we didn't want to make, right? And that in order to solve that, we would have to access some higher power, right? And that really is that is an expression of an archetypal approach to solving alcoholism, which is why it works so well. um and then finally, in conclusion, and I love this quote, Jung says, in God all the opposites are abolished. And you know, in terms of this helpful formula, um that we're talking about wholeness, right? And coming to understand a fusion of the opposites. Wilson expresses this idea when he says that we were placed in a position of neutrality, safe and protected, right? He says the problem was just removed, we ceased fighting. So that's a good description of wholeness. And that we're not judging one as better than the other. Like, we don't have those opinions anymore. We're just where we are, and we're grateful on the one hand that we went through what we went through, and we recognize that it really fuels us into the spiritual realm. And that's what happens when we achieve a conjunction of the opposites, or the coniunctio oppositorum. Um and and this is what Jung has to say in regards to both being both, right? That when we talk about, spiritus contra spiritum, we're not saying that it means to counter alcoholism with spirituality, but that we're actually looking for a middle position, safe and protected. And this is how Jung says it. He says, today there exist supreme possibilities both for good and for evil. Usually, however, it is first one and then the other. The good man succumbs to evil, the sinner is converted to good, and that, to the uncritical eye, is the end of the matter. But those endowed with a finer moral sense or deeper insight cannot deny that this seeming one after another is in reality a happening of events side by side. And perhaps no one has realized this more clearly than St. Paul, who knew that he bore a thorn in the flesh, and that the messenger of Satan smote him in the face, lest he be exalted above measure. The one after another is a bearable prelude to the deeper knowledge of the side by side. And this is an incomparably more difficult problem. It's so paradoxical. Again, the view that good and evil are spiritual forces outside us, and that man is caught in the conflict between them, is more bearable by far than the insight that the opposites are the ineradicable and indispensable preconditions of all psychic life, so much so that life itself is guilt. And yeah, and I love this quote so much, I don't have much to add to it. So I'm going to go ahead and call her quits right here, and I will stop sharing, and I'm back to you. I hope you guys were able to follow. I hope it was all right.